Today we're going to learn how to build a 4-inch block lead. By now you should have learned how to spread mortar for block work, how to build an 8-inch block rack back lead, and how to build an 8-inch block full-size lead. I'll put links to those videos down in the description. This is what our stock area should look like. I have my tool bag, a 4-foot level in a block cell, enough stock to build the project, 16-hole block, and 3 half block are required to build this lead. Right now I only have 2 halves. We're going to go back to the saw and make one more half, and I'll show you how to do that. I also have a mortar pan with enough mortar to build the entire lead. This is a close-up look of the 4-inch block we're going to be using. These are solid 4-inch block. These are solid concrete. When we stock them up for our project, we want to stock them right side up. There is a top and bottom to these blocks, just like with the 8-inch block. The top is a little bit smoother than the bottom. This is the bottom. I'm going to flip this block over. Now when we lay it, we have a nice smooth surface to put our level on. Like I said, these are solid block. Here we have a 4-inch hollow block. It has cells in it. This is the top and this is the bottom. Just like with the other block, there's a top and bottom, and the top is smoother than the bottom. Here we have a 4-inch hollow. This is what's called a ground face block. The face of the block has been ground off to a smooth surface. This block was made with white concrete. And they grind the face off for a nice smooth decorative surface, very similar to a terrazzo floor. Here we have a 4-inch split face block. This is super rough. Still made of concrete. This is a 4-inch split face hollow. The way they make these, basically they'll make this into a big 8-inch block, and then they'll split it right down the middle, and we get this rough look. Some people like this look, usually found on the outside of buildings. There's many other types of 4-inch block. That's all that I have on hand right now. They have tile face block, fluted block, different colors, different types of 4-inch block. These are solid. That's going to give us an indication on how we should spread mortar for this project. And I'll go over that in a little bit. We're going to need to cut this block in half so that we have enough halves to build the project. We're going to go do that on the wet saw. This is the wet saw that we're going to be using. And it might look intimidating if this is the first time you're using it. It's big. When we turn it on, it's going to be loud. There's going to be water flying everywhere. It's actually very safe. This is the blade that cuts through the block. It's not even sharp. This is a diamond blade. There's diamonds, small pieces of diamond in this blade that wears away the material that you're cutting. It doesn't cut like a pair of scissors. this wears away some of the material. And we need to keep that in mind when we're making cuts on the saw. I'm going to show you how to line the block up and how to measure so that we cut this block perfectly in half. Setting the block up on the table, there's usually a ruler here that tells us the measurements. Just like any other saw you're going to find on the job site, all the numbers are worn off. It's worn away. We're going to need to measure for ourselves. We put the block up on the table. We put it against this part of the table. This part of the table goes vertical. This is called the fence. We put the block up against the fence. The fence is perpendicular to the blade. We want to make a nice straight cut through this block. Well, now we need to know what is the size, what is the length of half of a block. We're going to need to do a little bit of math. We can buy these blocks as factory halves. They come from the factory already in half. They're made that way. If we're cutting a block in half, we need to think about some measurements. The overall length of a block is 15 5/8. We would like to have 7 5/8 as a half block. Only we're not going to make it that size. Well, why not? We want to be able to cut this block and get 2 pieces out of 1. This is where the math comes into play. We're going to cut this block to 7 3/4. Well, if this half is 7 3/4 and this half is 7 3/4, we add that up, we only get 15.5 inches. Well, the entire block is 15 5/8 of an inch. Remember, this is a diamond blade and this wears away the material. This blade is about 1/8 of an inch thick, and it's going to wear away 1/8 inch of material when we cut this block. So we'll have 7 3/4, 1/8 of an inch worn away, and then 7 3/4 on the other side. So we're getting 2 pieces out of 1. That 7 3/4 isn't exactly what we're looking for. We would like to have 7 5/8 inch pieces. These pieces are going to be 1/8 of an inch bigger than what we would like. We're going to make up that difference in the very first head joint that we build on the lead. This is a fast way of getting 2 halves. We're getting 2 blocks with 1 cut. We have the block set on the table up against the fence. I'm going to slide the table to the saw blade. I'm going to use the foot pedal down below to bring the saw blade down to the block. This frees up both of my hands. I'm using my foot right now, and I'll show you what that looks like from the side in a little bit. I want to measure from the blade 7 3/4 of an inch to the end of the block. If I have 7 3/4 of an inch on this side, I know that I have 7 3/4 of an inch on this side. Right now the block is placed perfectly on the table. We're ready to cut. This is what the view looks like from the side. This table slides back and forth into and out of the saw blade. We're going to control the unit with our hands. We can control the saw blade with our foot, putting pressure on the foot pedal. We can also grab this handle and pull the saw blade down without using our foot, or we can use both together. We want to keep control of the unit as we're sliding it through the saw blade. The saw blade is spinning super fast. and it's going to want to pull the unit towards the back of the saw. We need to be able to control it. Ideally, we want the saw blade cutting downwards into the block, forcing the block down into the table. We don't want the saw to get ahead of the unit that we're cutting. It's going to want to throw the unit to the back of the saw, and every bricklayer has done this. This saw controls dust by using water. I'm going to turn the water on, then I'm going to turn the saw on. It's going to get really loud. We're going to need to put on our PPE before we use the saw. Safety glasses and earmuffs at a minimum. If we're cutting all day on the saw, even if we're outside, and even though this is a wet saw, you might want to put a respirator on. You sort of don't need to if you have enough water flow controlling the dust. If the water flow gets too light, we're going to start emitting dust into the air, and that's dangerous. I'm going to turn the water on, I'm going to turn the saw on, and I'll make this cut. Our block is cut in half now. We're ready to bring it back to our station and set it up on top of our stock. Ideally, we would cut these ahead of time, maybe a day in advance. Now the block are wet, that makes it slightly more difficult when we go to lay them. I brought the halves back to the project. Really, we only needed one of them. I already had two of them. I'm going to set them next to our stockpile on the ground because we're not going to be using halves right away. We're going to take a look at what tools we're going to need for the project now. These are the tools we're going to use to complete the project. We're going to use a chalk line, tape measure, and a pencil for laying out the project. We're going to use our float, sled runner, striking iron, and brush to finish the project at the very end. For the most part, the only tools we're going to use to build the project are trowel, tape measure, and 4-foot level. We're going to try to leave out our hammer, and I'll show you why in a little bit. We're also going to leave out our 2-foot level. Just these three tools are what we're going to use to build the project. We're going to start by snapping a chalk line a comfortable distance away from our stockpile. If there's nobody around to help you, just use a block to hold the chalk line down. Pull the line. We can make this a lot longer than what we need. And snap a chalk line. Now that we have our chalk line snapped, we're going to use our tape measure and put our bond marks on the line. The chalk line is representing the outside of the wall, meaning we're going to lay the block to this side of the chalk line. I'm going to want the marks on the outside of the chalk line. Pull your tape out and lock it. We're going to mark the end of the tape measure. This is going to represent our jam end. 15 5/8, 16 inches. That's our first head joint. 31 5/8, 32. 47 5/8, 48. And our last one, 63 5/8. We don't need to mark this 64-inch increment. We're not continuing block that way. Now we're ready to start building the lead. I'm going to spread mortar on the floor, but I don't want to cover up the chalk line. I'm going to let the mortar fall off of the trowel. We're not face shell bedding right now. We're just getting mortar on the floor. These are solid block and they're heavy. You would think that these blocks would want to sink when we place them on the mortar. It's actually the opposite. Because they have a solid bottom to them, there isn't much area for the mortar to spread to. If we're laying hollow block, the mortar can go into the cores of the block. Since the bottoms of these blocks are solid, there just isn't too much area for the mortar to go. I'm going to slightly smooth out the mortar. Not really furrowing the mortar, smoothing it out. This is just for the first course. We have a nice bed of mortar spread. We're going to start laying the block. These blocks are heavy. Grab them with two hands. I'm looking at the pencil lines that we had established, and I'm looking at the chalk line. This block is right where it should be. I'm at the pencil line, this pencil line, and I'm at the chalk line. I'm going to continue laying the rest of this course, and then we're going to plumb and level these blocks. A little different from 8-inch block. These blocks are also solid 4s. We should be spreading for these blocks in a certain way. If the architect specified solid block, in this case solid 4s, that means we should have solid head joints between the block. We're not going to be putting head joints on the block the way we put them on 8-inch block, sort of just to the outside. We want this joint solid in between the block, full of mud, full of mortar. There shouldn't be any voids in the head joints. Shouldn't be any space. We can smear mortar on the head joints just like before to help the mortar stick, but we can load up our trowel with mortar and just plop it on there. That's going to give us a nice solid head joint. As I'm laying the block, right now I'm holding 100% of the weight, 80% of the weight, 50% of the weight, maybe 20% of the weight, and now I'm letting go. Just like with the other block, we don't want to set these too fast. The mortar is going to squeeze out and the block's going to be set too low. If you look close, you might see me moving this block up and down. I'm moving the block up and down and pushing it that way to the left and squeezing this head joint, squeezing the mortar out of that head joint. We have our first course laid. We're going to need to level these, and I'll show you what that looks like up close. And we're going to need to plumb each one of these blocks individually. When we built our 8-inch lead, we used our level and put it perpendicular on the top of each block. We're not going to do that in the case of 4-inch block. We're going to plumb the face of each one of these blocks individually. The top of the 4-inch block sometimes can be a little off and a little curved. There isn't much room for our level to sit. If we level the block this way, it can be out of plumb on the face. Here we're looking at a side view of our layout course. Putting the level on top, we want to get the tops of these blocks nice and level. We're not going to use our hammer for this project. There's a particular reason why. 4-inch block, you would think, since they're smaller than 8-inch block, that they would be easier to lay. Not really. Every block has its own unique characteristic of how they're laid. 4-inch block are a little more difficult to plumb, to keep perfectly vertical. They want to rock back and forth as we build up. Using a hammer to bang down on the tops of blocks will have a tendency to cause the lower courses to start rocking. We want to learn to be able to spread just enough mortar that we're holding the block up, and we don't need to beat them down so aggressively with a hammer. That means our mortar also needs to be the right consistency. Right now, I'm just trying to get the tops of these blocks level. When we did the 8-inch lead, we put our level perpendicular on the block. We're not going to do that with these blocks. We're going to reach over the face, cut our mortar away, and we're going to plumb the face of each one of these blocks individually. We'll go right down the line. We're going to keep our area neat, gather up our excess mortar, and throw it back in our pan. After we plumb the face of every block, we're going to make sure that they are nice and straight edged. And they should be pretty close. If we laid them correctly in line with our chalk line, these are going to be pretty close to in line with each other after we plumb them up. Now we're at the jam end of our lead. We're going to need to plumb up the jamb. Just because this block is level across the top doesn't mean the jamb is plumb. Well, what takes precedence? Which is more important? This block being level or this jamb being plumb? This jamb being plumb takes importance over this block being level. When we strike this block work up, we're going to be using our sled runner. If this block is slightly out of square, if this block was slightly manufactured out of square, it's going to be hidden when we strike it up with our sled runner. Having this jamb plumb takes precedence over the top of this block being level. In this case, it's pretty close both ways. Our jamb is plumb, the face of each block is plumb, and are in line with each other. We have one more thing to do before we go to the next course, and that's check our height. We can use our modular ruler if we want to in this case. My particular preference, it's just way easier to use a tape measure. We want to be right at 8 inches, and we look good. We're ready to go to our next course. Before we start spreading mortar for the next course, we can double check our overall measurement. You sort of don't have to if you stick with the pencil lines that you originally drew. We should be at exactly 63 5/8, and we are. It's more important to check on the subsequent courses with our tape measure, our overall length, our overall bond. Since we had the marks already drawn on the floor, not too important to check, as long as you stick with your bond marks. We got an up-close look at what our mortar should look like when we spread it on top of our block. We want the bed joints to be solid in this particular case, in this particular wall. If we're using solid 4-inch block, we should have solid bed joints. And what we'll do on the next few courses, we'll make pretend that we're laying hollow 4-inch block, and we'll spread a little different. We're going to lay our first half. We're going to look real close at our halves. We have the cut side and we have the factory side. We want to lay the cut side towards our first head joint. We don't want to put the cut on the jamb of the lead. We don't want to put the cut facing up. We don't want to put the cut facing down. This block was cut to a 7 3/4 inch length. We don't want the block to be sideways, meaning the cut going down or up. That's going to make our bed joint look not so great. It's going to cause our bed joint to be real tight around this block. Remember, this block is 7 3/4 inch long. It's 1/8 of an inch longer than a typical half. We're going to need to make up that difference in the very first head joint. We're going to need to spread this head joint a little thinner. I'll smear it. We still want it solid, not as much mortar. As I'm laying the block, I'm looking down at this corner and its relationship to the block below. I don't want this bottom corner to be sticking out past or to be sticking too far in. I want it to be flush with the block below. That's going to help us when we plumb the block up. We'll continue with the rest of this course. Now we're back to regular size head joints. And we still want them nice and solid. Now we're simply going to repeat the process like we did with the first course. We're going to put the level on top. This part is a little high right here. Again, we don't want to beat these blocks crazy. If we start hitting down on these blocks too much, we're going to start moving the block below. And we've already plumbed those blocks up. They're fine, they're perfect. They're right where we want them. Make sure it's nice and level. Now we're going to put the level on the face of the block, just like we did before. Only we're not going to do every single block this time. We're only going to do the ends. We're going to do the tail end. This is called the tail end. And we're going to go all the way back to the jam end. Now for all the block in the middle, we're going to do what's called straight edge them. If this block is plumb all the way at the tail, and this block is plumb all the way at the jam, we can put our level horizontally at the bottom of the block, and we can move the block in the middle out to the level, or we might have to move them the other way. I'm then going to move the level to the top of the block. What I'm not doing, I don't want to move this block, and I don't want to move our jam block. Those are both plumb. The faces of those are both plumb. We just want to manipulate the block in the middle. If this block is plumb and this block is plumb, and we've manipulated the block in the middle to be flat with them, these two blocks are plumb now. We'll go to our jam and plumb that up. We're looking okay. We have two measurements to check before we go to our next course. We're going to check our overall bond. We can put our tape measure right on to the top of the block. We're looking for 55 and 5/8, and we're good. That means our head joints are the correct size. We're not too far ahead, and we're not too far behind. We need to check our height also. When we check height, we only check it from one spot. Either, I'm not even going to say either the jam end or the tail end. We're only going to check it at the jam end. Our floor, our footing, can be out of level. But we don't make our lead out of level. We make our lead perfectly level. If our floor was out of level and we were to check height here at the jam end and at the tail end, we would just be making our lead out of level. We only check it in one spot and we level over from that spot. We want to be at exactly 16 inches, and we are. That means we're good to go to our next course. Now we're done our first 2 courses of block work. If you want to, we can do a little make pretend. We can make pretend the rest of this lead is going to be built with hollow 4-inch block. Well, how's that going to change anything? Well, that's going to change our spreading technique. We can go back to face shell bedding. Hollow 4-inch block don't need to have solid bed joints. No reason. The block are hollow themselves. Same thing for the head joints. We can go back to sort of face shell bedding on the head joints like we did with 8-inch block. It's not easier or harder any particular way. It's just different. We can go back to forming our loaf, snapping our trowel, bring our trowel on the block and spreading just the face of the block. Same thing on the inside. What we do have to pay attention to is how much mortar we spread. If we spread a little heavier on one side and lighter on the other side, when we lay the block, that's going to make the block want to tip either way. So we need to have a pretty even spread if we're going to go with this technique. Now that we have a couple courses established, it's way easier to get this block, this jam block, plumb. We have 2 courses of block work below this to look down, to sight down this corner. And I can get this block lined up with those 2 courses. And I know that this jam is going to be pretty close to plumb. The top of this block is going to be pretty close to level. We can, if you want, we can go back to the way we spread head joints for the 8-inch block, heel to toe and then toe to heel. Again, we're making pretend that we're laying hollow 4-inch block. I'm looking down the face, making sure the bottom of the block is even with the face of the block below. You'll see I still have one hand on this block. I'm holding up probably 20% of the weight right now, still, of the block. We spread less mortar than we did on the previous courses. These blocks will sink a little easier. If you want to start working on faster techniques, we can work on applying head joints with sort of 2 motions. Without smearing the block, if you do this step fast enough, you can get away with applying head joints on both sides of the block with 1 trowel of mortar. We're going to whip the trowel sort of up the side. This is going to take some practice. We have a head joint on this side. I still have mortar on the trowel. We can bring the trowel around to this side of the block and slap a head joint on this side. 2 quick motions. We'll get a head joint on both sides of the block. If you do it too slow, the head joint's going to fall off. If you do it at the wrong angle, you're gonna miss. If you do it at the wrong angle on the face of the block out here on this face, you can jam the toe of your trowel into the block and knock it out of alignment. We'll level. Just a few taps. Doesn't take much. If we spread mortar appropriately, again, we shouldn't have to be beating these blocks down into place. We're level. Now I'm going to plumb the tail end right at the very end of the block. I'm going to go back to the jam end right at the very end of the block. Now I'm going to straight edge. Even these two end block. These two end block can be like pinball paddles. We might have the ends correct. One block can be going out like this. The other one can be going in. Putting our level as a straight edge across the face to these two plumb points helps us get everything in line. I'll go to the jam and plumb this up. Should be close. There we are. You gotta move it out a touch. Two measurements to check: height and bond. 47 5/8 is what we're looking for, and we're good. We're maybe a 1/16 of an inch short. We'll check our height. Should be right at exactly 24 inches, and we are. If anything, we might be a 1/16 too high. That's going to tell me for the next course, maybe I should spread just a touch less, just a touch. I'm not going to tap that block down. It's close enough. It's definitely within tolerance. We'll move on to our fourth course. Here we're looking at the jam end of our lead, and it's complete. We're at the full 7 courses high. I'd like to show you the importance of spreading the correct amount of mortar and having the right consistency of mortar. If I were to start beating this block around, I'm moving, I don't know if it's showing up on camera, I'm moving the entire lead back and forth. This is relatively unstable. Usually you're not going to be building a 4-inch block lead by itself. Usually it's going to have some type of backup. We might be tying this wall into a stud wall that's already been built. This might be a block veneer, like with the rock face block, or with fluted block, or with the ground face block, or a glazed block. Usually it's going to be tied into a backup. very unstable. You can even search on YouTube of a 4-inch block wall falling down on a bunch of guys. Those guys are professionals. A 4-inch block wall freestanding is pretty unstable, and that's what makes 4-inch block a little more difficult to work with than 8-inch block. You need to spread correctly, have the correct amount of mortar, and not beat them so much with your trowel, or especially with a hammer. You're going to start moving the stuff down below, and you're going to cause the lead, the wall, to become out of plumb. Our lead is complete. Now we're going to start the tooling process. You might also hear the terms jointing up, striking, pointing up. They're all the same thing. Tooling the joints. We're going to start with our head joints. In theory, our joints should be full. Sometimes there's going to be small voids where we need to apply a little bit more mortar to the joints. Let's start with our head joints. This is a fresh lead. All of this mortar is still wet. I'm not going to put a lot of force into tooling these joints. I don't want to push the wall. There are a good amount of chips in these blocks. Big old chip right here we're going to need to take care of. A chip here we'll need to take care of. A little one here, medium-sized one here, little one here, especially on these corners. We're going to use our sled runner for the bed joints, pressing lightly. This is giving us a concave joint. We have a concave striking iron and a concave sled runner. It's tooled. Now we're going to use our sponge float to go over any ooze that's coming out. We're also going to use it to take care of these chips in the block work. You can't do this step if you're laying those ground face block, tile block, rock face block. You can't fill in the chips with mortar. That's the face, that's the design. If you have a chip in a ground face block, you might need to put that block aside and not lay it. In theory, this wall is going to get painted. And we can fill in the chips with mortar, and once they're painted over, you'll never know that there was a chip in the block. At the very bottom of the lead, we're going to use our sponge float so that we have a nice sharp 90-degree inside corner from the floor to the layout ports. We don't strike or tool the very first bed joint. That gets flat, not concave. Everything's struck and floated. If you want to add the step of brushing the wall, you can. Some guys don't. It doesn't really matter. You're going to do what you think looks the best. If you think it looks better brushing it and then polishing it, do that. If you're an apprentice and you're out on the job and you're working with another bricklayer and he brushes the wall, an experienced bricklayer, you're going to brush the wall. If he doesn't brush the wall, you're not going to brush the wall. You're going to do whatever he does. You want to match him. Not every bricklayer does it the same way. Now we're going to polish the joints. Starting from the bottom, we're going to go right up the wall, doing the head joints first. When we get to the areas that we patched with mortar, we're going to try not to dig the striking iron into that chip. That's all soft mortar. We'll go back to our sled runner and lightly polish the bed joints. That's one side of the wall. We can do this to both sides, and we can do this at the jamb. I'll get a close-up of the jamb. Here's the jamb. Here's the top course in particular. Usually, you're not going to be striking up the jamb of a 4-inch wall. Something like this. This is usually going to go up against something. This might be an expansion joint. We might have an expansion joint here, and a wall might continue further. Usually, you're not going to see the end of a wall, but we can practice striking up our outside corners. We want these to be concave both ways. And if there's any chips, we can fill them in also. It's just added practice. I'm going to float and then polish. When you're all done the lead, clean off the tail end of the lead. Don't save this for the next bricklayer. It's going to be running in the wall, going that way. There is a slang name to this part of the process that I'm not going to say. If you know it, you can write it down in the comments. That concludes the building process for a 4-inch block lead. You would think that 4-inch block are easier to lay than 8-inch block, and they're not. That's why you do the 8-inch block lead first, in my opinion. Those are the easiest block to start with. 4-inch block are relatively unstable, and they want to move on you as you're building. Typically, solid 4-inch block are going to be used in foundations below grade, especially in other countries. They use them below grade a lot in other countries. Towards the beginning of the lead, what I didn't go over was how we spread for bed joints in the first couple courses. I purposely didn't go over the technique or the term of furrowing mortar. I'm going to save that for when you get to brickwork. That's a technique used in spreading mortar for bed joints in brickwork. We furrow the mortar. When you're building this project, just concentrate on trying to get the bed joints smoothed out, even and solid. That's it for the 4-inch block lead video. I hope you enjoyed it.